#HFY Tales, service with a smile. The tiny frontier outpost on the barren moon of Torvex 7 wasn't much to look at. A few prefabricated buildings clustered together under a massive geodesic dome, surrounded by an endless expanse of cracked, gray terrain. It was the kind of place that most species avoided, a remote mining colony where boredom was only interrupted by the occasional equipment failure or meteor strike. But to humanity, it was an opportunity. Torvex 7 had no strategic value, no rare minerals, and certainly no picturesque scenery. What it did have was a mix of alien settlers, Zelvatians, Quarks, and a few Vorlithans, each of whom had nowhere else to go, refugees, outcasts, and wanderers from species that didn't always get along. Tensions ran high, and morale ran low. Enter humanity. Specifically, enter Maggie, a cheerful human who had just opened Maggie's Diner, the moon's first and only restaurant. Maggie wasn't an engineer, a soldier, or even a diplomat. She was a cook, a good one, and she knew the fastest way to break down barriers between species was with food and a warm smile. The diner was simple, gleaming counters, booths lined with scratch-proof material, and a menu scrawled on a holographic board. But Maggie's cooking was anything but simple. Using a mix of alien spices and earth ingredients, she created dishes that defied expectations. The first customer to wander in was a Zelvatian named Truvak, a crystalline being who communicated through light pulses. Maggie didn't flinch at his appearance, even when his glowing body made the shadows in the diner dance. "What can I get for you?" Maggie asked, her tone as bright as the diner's neon lights. Truvak blinked rapidly, a Zelvatian laugh. "Do you even have food I can eat?" Maggie grinned. "Try me." Minutes later, she set down a dish of gelatinous cubes infused with heat-sensitive spices that shimmered in the light. Truvak hesitated, then sampled it. His crystals glowed a vibrant blue, signaling joy. This is incredible," he said, his voice resonating like a wind chime. Word spread quickly. The Quarks, a species of bipedal lizards with a notorious love for salty foods, came next. Maggie whipped up a dish that combined earth seaweed with an alien mineral that tingled like static on their forked tongues. They left the diner hissing with delight. Even the Vorlithans, a notoriously stoic race covered in tough exoskeletons, found themselves drawn in. Maggie figured out how to bake a crusty, protein-rich bread that cracked satisfyingly between their mandibles. Each day, the diner filled with customers, and each day, Maggie greeted them with the same radiant smile. It didn't matter what species they were or what grudges they carried. Inside Maggie's Diner, everyone was treated the same, with respect, warmth, and good food. The breakthrough came during a particularly tense afternoon. A Zelvatian miner and a Quarks mechanic started arguing over the use of shared equipment. Their shouting echoed through the dome until Maggie stepped out from behind the counter, holding 2 plates. "Hey," she said calmly, sliding the plates onto their table. "On the house, eat first, fight later." They glared at each other, but hunger won out. The food was too good to ignore. By the time they finished, their tempers had cooled, and the argument ended in a handshake, or the closest equivalent their species had. Months passed, and Maggie's Diner became more than a restaurant. It was a refuge, a neutral ground where everyone on Torvex 7 could gather. Arguments faded, cooperation grew, and the settlers started seeing themselves as a community rather than a collection of outcasts. One day, a Vorlithan ambassador arrived on the moon, curious about reports of the human who fixed a colony with cooking. He entered the diner, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the counter. Maggie, unfazed, slid him a plate of her latest creation, something she called universal pancakes, designed to be palatable to any species. The ambassador took a bite, paused, and then let out a low, rumbling laugh. "I see why they talk about you, human. You serve more than food, you serve hope." Maggie smiled as she wiped her hands on her apron, just doing what humans do best, bringing people together. And hey, it's all about service with a smile. Epilogue. Years later, when Torvex 7 became a thriving trade hub, settlers would tell newcomers about Maggie's Diner. They'd say it wasn't just a place to eat, it was the heart of the colony, built on the simple but powerful idea that kindness and good food could bridge any divide. And in the corner of the diner, under a framed picture of Earth, a small plaque read, "In space, as on Earth, the best recipe for peace is service with a smile." Part 2, The Galactic Reach. As Torvex 7 prospered, Maggie's reputation spread beyond the small mining colony. One day, a representative from the Galactic Council, a distinguished alien species that governed the collective, arrived on the moon. The council had heard rumors of humanity's ability to unify species, and they were curious about the methods that Maggie had employed. Ambassador Varix, a towering, insectoid being with segmented limbs and multifaceted eyes, had traveled across multiple star systems to meet Maggie in person. The message that had reached him was clear: if food and a smile could end territorial disputes and forge alliances, perhaps it could be the key to resolving galactic tensions. Maggie greeted him as she did every other guest, with her trademark warmth. "Welcome to Maggie's Diner," she said, sliding a menu over to the ambassador. Varix blinked his multifaceted eyes at her, the glistening plates on the counter catching his attention. "I am curious about your methods, human," Varix began, his voice buzzing in a rhythmic cadence. "How have you managed to bring peace where others have failed? This colony was once a nest of unrest." Maggie leaned on the counter, unperturbed. "Peace isn't as hard as people think. You just need to listen. People, no matter their species, are more alike than we realize. And if you feed them, they'll talk, they'll open up. It's all about treating each other with respect and finding common ground, no matter how small. That's how I bridge divides." Varix was silent for a moment, processing her words. He then nodded, his many eyes narrowing in thought. "I see. You speak of harmony, of unity, but do you believe your methods could work across an entire galaxy?" Maggie's smile was unwavering. "If it worked here, it can work anywhere. Food, service, and a smile, those are universal concepts. We may look different, talk differently, or have different customs, but the hunger for peace is the same in everyone. Just give them a seat at the table, and you'll see." Part 3, A Galactic Summit. Weeks later, Maggie was invited to a diplomatic summit hosted by the Galactic Council. She couldn't believe it. Humanity, with its reputation for wild ambition and unpredictability, was being called upon to offer solutions for a galaxy on the brink of war, and the weapon they were asking for was food. The summit was to be held on a massive space station, the Concordia Spire *, a neutral ground where representatives from hundreds of species would gather. The goal was to address the increasing number of disputes over resources, borders, and ideology. It was humanity's first real test on the galactic stage. When Maggie arrived at the Spire, she was greeted by a delegation of ambassadors from various races, each with their own unique cultural significance. The room was filled with diverse, powerful beings, and for the first time in her life, Maggie felt out of place. But then she saw the kitchen. It was massive, designed to accommodate every kind of cuisine imaginable. Maggie stepped into the kitchen, took a deep breath, and began preparing her dishes. Her mind worked in tandem with her hands. She knew that this meal wasn't just for sustenance. It was the opportunity to shape the future of the galaxy. One by one, she prepared dishes that were adapted for each species, carefully blending their traditional flavors with her own innovative techniques. She even made sure to include universal dishes, like the famous universal pancakes, which had become a symbol of unity back on Torvex 7. Part 4, The Meal That Changed Everything. The summit began, and the air was thick with tension. Negotiations were at a standstill, with species unable to reach any meaningful agreements. Each representative was entrenched in their demands, unwilling to budge. As the day wore on, the atmosphere became heavy with frustration. Then, Maggie entered the grand hall, carrying trays of steaming dishes, each one representing a different species. She set them down on the long table where the ambassadors sat. The dishes were vibrant, aromatic, and inviting. Maggie stood at the head of the table and smiled. "Please, everyone, try my food. Let's eat before we continue. Sometimes, the best way to find common ground is to share a meal." The ambassadors exchanged uncertain glances. It wasn't protocol, it wasn't even expected, but slowly, they began to taste the food. A Vorlithan ambassador, who had once remained silent and stoic, broke into a surprised chuckle as he sampled a crispy, protein-packed dish Maggie had created just for them. The Zelvatarian diplomat, who was known for his gruff demeanor, closed his eyes in delight as he tasted a spicy broth Maggie had blended from his species' favorite ingredients. A Quark's representative, long wary of the other species in the room, took a cautious bite of the seaweed-infused dish Maggie had prepared, his scales rippling in pleasure. As each species tasted the food, something remarkable happened. The atmosphere shifted. Barriers that had once seemed immovable began to crumble. Conversations that had been cold and distant started to warm. The ambassadors began talking not just about their demands, but about their cultures, their hopes, and their fears. Maggie watched from the side, her heart swelling with quiet pride. It wasn't the food that had caused the breakthrough, it was the act of sharing it. The simple gesture of offering a meal with kindness and respect allowed them to see each other as equals, not as adversaries. By the end of the meal, the summit had transformed from a deadlock into a collaborative effort. Agreements were forged, compromises were made, and a new era of cooperation began to take shape. The Galactic Council, once divided, was now united in their resolve to build a better future together. Epilogue, A Galaxy United. Years later, Maggie's legacy was felt across the stars. Diplomats and leaders from various species came to Torvex 7, hoping to learn the simple but powerful lessons that had transformed the galaxy: kindness, food, and a smile. Maggie's Diner became a symbol, not just of human ingenuity, but of the unifying power of empathy. The galaxy would never forget the human who brought peace not through politics or war, but through something as simple as asterisk service with a smile. And every time a new alliance was forged, and every time a negotiation found a peaceful resolution, the galactic lead. Part 5, Maggie's diplomacy goes galactic. As the years passed, Maggie's influence continued to ripple through the galaxy. Torvex 7, once an isolated, struggling colony, had become the heart of interspecies diplomacy. The human who had started with a small diner on a barren moon had inadvertently become a key figure in shaping the future of galactic relations. Humanity's impact went far beyond just offering food and hospitality. Maggie had unlocked a universal truth: the act of sharing food wasn't just about sustenance. It was about showing respect for each other's cultures, understanding differences, and creating a space for dialogue. And as the galaxy's most diverse species continued to meet in her diner, they began to understand that the key to peace wasn't just compromise, it was empathy. But Maggie's work wasn't done yet. Word had spread across the galaxy about the human diplomat with the most unusual skills. As the collective became more powerful, so did the need for a permanent solution to its most serious conflicts, the war-torn regions along the Outer Rim, where different factions of aliens were locked in violent disputes over territory and resources. It was the most difficult challenge yet, but this time, Maggie was called upon to help. Part 6, The Galactic Crisis. The Outer Rim, a chaotic region of space, was home to many fringe colonies and independent civilizations. However, years of resource scarcity, territorial expansion, and deep ideological differences had torn the area apart. Various factions, some with centuries of grudges, had fought for control. The situation was precarious, and many feared an all-out war would soon break out, threatening the entire galaxy. Maggie, however, had a solution that had worked before: food, kindness, and a little bit of human ingenuity. The Galactic Council knew this approach could work, but it needed to be on a far grander scale. A summit was arranged at the heart of the Outer Rim, where the warring factions could finally meet in a neutral zone. Maggie was summoned to help bridge the divides. She was no diplomat, but she had proven time and time again that the simplest of gestures could change the course of history. Maggie stepped onto a ship bound for the summit, taking one last look at Torvex 7. She had grown attached to the little moon. But the galaxy needed her, and humanity needed to prove that kindness was more powerful than any weapon. Part 7, The Feast of Unity. When Maggie arrived at the summit, she was greeted by a room full of warlords, diplomats, and ambassadors, each representing one of the factions that had long been locked in conflict. The tension was thick, and for a moment, Maggie felt a twinge of doubt. Would food really work in a situation as dire as this? But Maggie wasn't one to back down. She set to work, drawing on all her experience. She knew these warring factions weren't so different after all. They all had their favorite dishes, their own customs, and, most importantly, their hunger. The hunger for more than just resources. They were hungry for peace. Hungry for a future without war. So, Maggie began cooking. She made dishes that honored each faction's culture, adapting them into an extravagant feast that would be served to all. There was a fiery quark stew with earth-grown spices, a delicate Zelvatian nectar dessert, Vorlothan-style grilled meat that would please even the most stoic warrior, and a special dish made with ingredients found only in the Outer Rim, food that none of the factions could resist. And, of course, she had a few universal favorites for everyone to share. But the true power of the meal came not from the food itself, but from the act of sitting together, of breaking bread side by side after centuries of bloodshed and distrust. As the first course was served, Maggie stood and made a simple announcement. I know we all have different beliefs, different needs, and different ways of living. But right now, we're all here for one reason: peace. Let's start by looking past our differences and enjoying a meal together. Tomorrow, we'll talk. But for now, let's eat. Part 8, A Galaxy Transformed. Hours passed. Conversations that had begun cold and bitter warmed as the factions shared stories, laughed, and, most importantly, ate together. The feast was a massive success. What was supposed to be a tense summit full of political maneuvering turned into a celebration of culture, unity, and shared humanity. By the time the meal was finished, many of the representatives had already come to terms with one another. The barriers between them had shattered. They had found common ground, not in a treaty or a compromise, but in their mutual respect for each other's traditions. That respect translated into cooperation. Maggie's methods, simple, human, and non-violent, had achieved what no diplomat or general had been able to do for centuries. The Outer Rim's factions agreed to an unprecedented ceasefire, and a treaty was signed on the very same day. The war was over. Epilogue: The Legacy of Service with a Smile. News of the Outer Rim peace spread throughout the galaxy. Humanity's influence was now undeniable. Maggie's diner became a symbol of peace, and soon, similar establishments began to appear across the stars, places where species of all kinds could come together, not just to negotiate or fight, but to share meals and stories. In time, Maggie's philosophy of service with a smile became a guiding principle for diplomacy across the galaxy. Leaders, once hardened by war, were now focused on the importance of empathy, listening, and finding common ground. Humanity had shown that sometimes the best way to solve problems wasn't with force or treaties, but with something as simple, and as profound, as a shared meal. And as Maggie sat in her diner one quiet evening, looking out at the stars, she couldn't help but smile. The galaxy was a little kinder, a little more united, and it was all thanks to a human with a warm heart, a quick wit, and an endless supply of pancakes.